Hello, and thank you for viewing this video segment titled Managing Security in the Cloud. I'm Lynda Stadtmueller, Program Manager for Business Communication Services at Frost Sullivan, and I'll be your host today. This is our third video in a three-part series on cloud computing featuring our IBM cloud leaders. Rick Telford, Vice President, IBM Cloud Services, Rich Cocchiara, Distinguished Engineer and Chief Technology Officer for Business Continuity and Resilience Services, and Chris Lovejoy, Vice President, IBM Security Strategy. We hope you find this discussion engaging and relevant, and we encourage you to view the other two videos in the series. Video 1, Getting Started with Cloud Computing, choosing the right workload to put into a cloud environment. And Video 2, Ensuring your cloud is available and resilient. Okay, let's get started. Chris, enterprises always name security as their top concern about the cloud. I'll cite a few statistics from the recent IBM risk study. 77% of respondents believe that adopting cloud computing makes protecting privacy more difficult. 50% are concerned about a data breach or loss. And 23% worry about a weakening of corporate network security with cloud computing. What are the greatest security threats in cloud computing, and how do they differ from security threats to a private data center?
Okay. All great questions. I'll try to keep them all in my head. So to start, looking at cloud computing is really not significantly different than looking at hosted computing, or alternatively looking at computing in an enterprise where there is a hyper-virtualized infrastructure. So essentially, there isn't that much difference. I mean, there's a nuance. So from what do we worry about when it comes to cloud computing? Well, particularly with public cloud computing, we worry about loss of governance. Once we cede control to a third party, there's things we just obviously can't control. We worry about. That said, the specific things that are different that we would worry about in a cloud computing environment that we wouldn't worry about ordinarily include things like lock-in. If the cloud provider goes belly up, for instance, what happens to my service? What happens to my data? Is it accessible to me? If the contract terminates, is that data, is that service available to me? Can I migrate to another provider? Second thing that we worry about is isolation failure. This is an infrastructure level issue associated with data storage, networking capacity, and the ability for the provider to actually keep isolation between multiple tenants. Another thing that we particularly worry about is the management interfaces. Interestingly, within the cloud environments, we tend to make management interfaces available remotely over the web. And what happens is that these management interfaces can be vulnerable because most security issues today are focused at the application layer. So that's one of the areas that customers need to worry about. Another area is the data deletion, is the fact that data is persistent, and in a cloud environment, it's not going to go away. And so we have to recognize that specific control needs to be placed around the data so that if the contract terminates, you can be assured that it is gone. Another issue is the malicious insider, particularly within a cloud environment. When you realize that the bulk of security incidents are related to insiders either maliciously or inadvertently causing harm within the organization, and you recognize that within the cloud environment, that malicious insider has a bigger span of control than they ordinarily would have in a heterogeneous environment, it's something to watch. And then last, there is a bit of a compliance risk. So many customers are worried about what does it mean to comply within a world where my data is flowing cross-border.
Chris, that's some really good points there, especially around the data deletion, because that's something that we've grappled with too within BCRS, is how do we ensure that once we have data, that we have the ability, of course, that once it needs to be deleted, to actually delete it and scrub it. Our information protection services are designed for customers to back up their data, but likewise, you have to be thinking about the life cycle management. So, as Chris had said, not only do you want to back up the data, but when you want to get rid of it, you have to absolutely make sure you get rid of it, because you do not want data to be hanging out and to be accessible somehow later by somebody who inadvertently accesses it.
That's a lot of risks we've talked about, and despite the risks, over 40% of enterprises are using or are planning to use cloud services, according to a Frost Sullivan survey. Can the risks be mitigated, or must enterprises only place low-risk workloads in the cloud?
My perspective is that a cloud can be more secure than a traditional environment, a traditional enterprise environment. Let me explain the why. So if you think about a traditional enterprise environment is a hodgepodge of different devices requiring lots of subject matter experts who are using specific tools to manage that infrastructure. A cloud computing environment is managed centrally, which means that you can apply a policy from the top and push it down and assure that the policy is applied equally across all of those resources and that those resources can be centrally managed. So when you recognize or realize that service management and the adoption of just basic good practice, top-down policy management equates to security success, what that also indicates is that a cloud environment well managed equals better security. Another area that we believe that security offers benefit, tangible benefit from a security perspective, is in the compliance and audit front. Now, most service providers, cloud providers, have implemented a level of logging and auditing that many organizations, traditional enterprises, can't perform themselves. They can't perform it because the tools and the expertise necessary to do that logging and auditing is hard to come by, and it's also expensive to actually store the data. And so that is a second area. The third area is on centralized security management, so patching, updating, centralized management of those systems. This ties back into my first point about overall services management, but the ability to sort of ubiquitously deliver security control to all of your assets immediately is something that's it's a very compelling statement. And so what I would say is that when it comes to low-risk workloads versus high-risk workloads, yes, you have to consider, is my workload ready for a cloud? But what I would suggest is that, with the right provider, the right SLA, and a good fundamental understanding of what that security architecture is, that the cloud can actually offer a better benefit from a security, what you spend for your bucks perspective than a traditional enterprise.
And I think also, Lynda, that from a risk mitigation perspective, in addition to security, the availability is a big issue for a lot of our customers, of course. So cloud providers are going to give them the ability to have a higher level of availability. Because right now, if you're a company with a single center, or even two centers in a small geographic location, your risk is pretty high. Okay? So the only way you can mitigate that risk is to either build yourself another center somewhere else, or utilize a cloud provider who can give you that capability on an ongoing basis, and you can use it and consume it as you need without having to build that. So I look at cloud as helping to really mitigate a lot of risks that otherwise could not be mitigated except through some very expensive infrastructure building.
Well, let me end with a question that I'm sure is on the minds of a lot of our viewers. How does IBM advise clients to get started in developing and executing a cloud security strategy? Chris, do you want to start?
Sure. What I would say is there's a few simple steps. The first step is to look at the workload and identify the risk profile for the workload. So look at the data and the sensitivity of the data, look at your availability requirements, look at your compliance requirements, and determine, what kind of profile does this particular cloud have. Second thing is engage an expert to help you build a secure cloud strategy. Now, when I say secure cloud strategy, I'm not saying a cloud security strategy. It is a cloud strategy with security interwoven into the fabric of the design, because security has to be an aspect of that overall program. It can't be something like we generally do, bolted on after the fact. Third thing you do is you negotiate a good SLA. Now, one warning about negotiating a good SLA is that if your provider is too willing to negotiate, what that indicates is that there may be a lack of table stakes, if you will, that have been implemented within the cloud. And so what you want to make sure of is that the SLA explicitly defines your responsibility, the provider's responsibility, what they are implementing, gives you, yes, some level of flexibility, but also, looks at the standards. And then the fourth thing is, once you have contracted with the provider, routinely assess your internet-facing applications, and if possible, assess your management interface as well. So those are really what I would say are the keys to sort of going down the path of looking at security, cloud design and implementation.
Let me echo what Chris just said. I mean, when I'm working with a client and they're interested in going to cloud, the first thing I ask them, of course, is, what are you worried about? What's keeping you up at night? What are the risks? What's the risk profile that you do have? And by understanding that, then we can create an architecture that works for them. Combination of their own infrastructure combined with our infrastructure. As Chris said, interrogate the cloud provider. I mean, who is it that you're working with? What is the service level agreement going to be looking like? How robust is their infrastructure? What are the backup and recovery capabilities that the cloud provider has? Where are they located? I mean, for us in BCRS, we have 164 locations around the world. So that is of great interest to our clients because, as Chris said, where are you going to put your data? So I ask the customers all the time, look at the risks that you've got, create an architecture that works for you, but when you're creating this hybrid architecture, combining yours with a cloud provider, make sure that the robustness of your cloud provider is as robust as yours, if not greater, because risks that you have that you need to mitigate, the cloud provider should help you do that. It shouldn't go the other way. You shouldn't be more risky than you were before.
I'll add to that. I think it's implied in what Chris and Rich said, but I think to render explicit, when you're doing that strategy, it should be holistic in nature, and it needs to look at all aspects of security. And so IBM's been, in the business of securing data centers for 40, 50 years, and so we've developed best practices, the IBM Security Framework, and you basically go through and you look at access control, you look at identity management, you look at data privacy and data security, you look at network, what's your network policies and endpoint security, physical security, application security. All those things should be part of your cloud security strategy. Just don't focus on one aspect or the other. The cloud, just like any other part of your IT data center, needs to cover all aspects of a security framework.
Well, thank you to our panel and to you, our viewers, for joining us today. Please look for the other videos in the series, and for information on cloud computing, turn to www.ibm.com/cloud. Thank you.